Good evening. I'm your host, Antoinette Jefferson, the author of 10 titles, 10 books available on Amazon, and I am also a graduate of the George Washington University Law School, in addition to several other universities where I hold degrees. I hold a degree from Thomas M. Cooley Law School. I hold a degree from American University Washington College of Law, Hampton University, Howard University, and Trinity Washington College of Law. Trinity University. I am now going to read from my text, Law, Race, and the Constitution in the Obama context. And this podcast will be a podcast regarding the books I've published over the last, say, 10 to 20 years. I published my first book in 2002, which was a fiction. The book here, Law, Race, and the Constitution, I'm going to address, and I'm going to start with an excerpt from African American Attorneys, The Business of Law or the Business of Change. It discusses Charles Hamilton Houston and being a social engineer. And here it begins. Charles Hamilton Houston's contributions to the American legal context and the reinvention of the social engineer in the 21st century. The notion of compromise is very important in the case of decolonization. This is a quote. For it is far from being a simple matter. Compromise, in fact, involves both the colonial system and the burgeoning national bourgeoisie. Thus, the rear guard of the national struggle, that section of the people who have always been on the other side, now find themselves catapulted to the forefront of negotiations and compromise, precisely because they have always been careful not to break ties with colonialism. Their preoccupation with objectivity constitutes a legitimate excuse for their failure to act. But this classic attitude of the colonized intellectual and the leaders of the nationalist parties is by no means objective. For them, there can be no doubt any attempt to smash colonial oppression by force is an act of despair, a suicidal act. This is written by Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, which was published by Grove Press in 1961. Introduction. Many 21st century African American attorneys are in the business of law and not the business of change. Is it possible for an African American attorney to be an engineer of social change? Is he not, by virtue of his training, and thus by definition, an instrument of the status quo? Now, Charles Hamilton Houston's work in developing the idea of the social engineer was novel and necessary for a period in which the struggle for African American liberation was pronounced. However, the terming of the phenomenon seemed nothing more than giving a name to what appeared to be the forced position of many African American attorneys. It seemed that attorneys of prominence became such through a struggle against the majority population for integration, justice, enfranchisement, and the like. In essence, it seemed that the prominent African American attorney had little opportunity to do more than be a social engineer, given the context in which Charles Hamilton Houston developed the idea. Media portrayals of civil rights attorneys during the early and mid 20th century appear to support this conclusion. Today, the African American attorney may have a choice to struggle around race issues or to enter a more mainstream practice of law. It should be noted that the idea of the African American attorney is a myth stemming from stereotypical portrayals of African Americans. Nevertheless, African Americans, as other racial groups, have had a collective identity and affiliation as reflected by racial categorization. Thus, in assuming a collective identity, for which there have been exceptions, Frantz Fanon's work suggests that those who have been educated in a particular system cannot render void that system which gives such a student his legitimacy. Thus, whether struggling with race or practicing mainstream law, e.g. corporate law or banking law, etc., there is little expectancy or possibility for the African American attorney to impact real change in the interest of the overall African American population. The contributions of African American professionals and attorneys, by extension, often reflect the progression of the capitalist agenda by which the society operates in maintaining wealth and power disparities between the rich and the poor. These contributions to society and educational achievements also reflect the African American attorney's aspiration for elitist reality. That is, by extrapolation of the idea of the colonized intellectual in Fanon's work, the African American attorney who practices law is enforcing the rules and regulations of the society in which he moves. He moves without delving into the politics of wealth and power disparities in a society that is supported by statistical data that African Americans still comprise an underclass. Christopher Bracey, in his lecture, Race, Racism, and the American Law, complicates the idea of a monolithic group of status quo African Americans, and by extension, African American attorneys. I offer that exclusive national organizations and informal affiliations create a circle of legal professionals who commune around legal issues while grappling with the reality of being part of the newly reinterpreted legal vanguard of the African American community. Moreover, the changes that are made in the law by African American attorneys in the 21st century exist along individual and class lines as opposed to mass change for the general African American population. An expansion of Carla Pratt's work on the role of black attorneys suggests that African American attorneys have learned to use networks to create opportunities for other competent and upwardly mobile African Americans. This differs from the agenda of impacting legislation as a go-between, or rather, such as was done during the civil rights movement. The African American attorney who chooses a struggle around race consciousness, delving into issues of critical race theory and other theories and practices that exist along the margins, may be choosing a lifestyle that leaves him on the outskirts of the legal profession. The irony is that in order to become a reputable attorney, even one who exists on the margins of academia and or the legal practice, one must first become reputable in mainstream academia and or the legal arena. Thus, the avant-garde attorney is still operating within the confines of prescribed societal limitations, or rather, the credentialed attorney risks co-optation as a result of choosing to enter the legal profession. Nevertheless, one must realize that the African American attorney is the mediator between the masses and the elite. Similar to the colonized intellectual of Frantz Fanon's work, acts as a go-between, assuaging the fears and concerns of the masses and elite. Although his intentions may be to create comfort for himself, he is undoubtedly catapulted into the position of assisting other African Americans. While the 21st century African American attorney does not engage in boycotts and sit-ins, his brand of social engineering is in the context of creating legacy, opportunity, and prestige for himself, his colleagues, his family, and his progeny. Because of the web of complex relationships of African Americans connected to the less privileged and more privileged through family, career, and leisure, the African American attorney inadvertently engineers change in multiple circles. But, as suggested by the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the subsequent lack of mass legislative changes in the 21st century, the impact of African American legal practice seems to be complicated by issues of class and culture. Race is less of a factor in the practice of law among practicing African American attorneys. In this paper, I will argue that African American attorneys in the 21st century reflect a reinterpreted vision of the Charles Hamilton Houston attorneys of the social engineer, by which, one, African American attorneys act as mediators and negotiators between the masses through their role as legal professional. Two, African American attorneys use contemporary approaches such as networking and nepotism, qualified by at least a minimum credentialing to create an elite vanguard of attorneys while also navigating the complex area of personal competence and comfort and familial obligations. And three, African American attorneys focus on a goal of navigating and conquering the nuances of the system rather than changing the entire system. The first three parts of the paper outline the neo-colonial theoretical paradigm, Charles Hamilton Houston and the birth of his idea of social engineering, and the goals of the Houstonian approach in social engineering. The next two sections discuss the characteristics of social engineers and the current roles of African American attorneys as discussed by various scholars. The last sections highlight the impact of social engineering on the legal professions, past and present, and the proposed role of African American attorneys in the 21st century. The new role reflects both the current American context and the historical role of social engineering. The current American context demonstrates society's attempt to move to a post-racial reality where social engineering is fluid and systemic changes exist along non-race lines. However, while society reflects an attitudinal move in this direction, current statistics support the fact that the overall population of African Americans still exists along the margins. Whether it is due to lack of exercising personal agency or institutional and structural restraints has been debated. Nevertheless, the reality of the situation points to the need to reinterpret the role of the African American attorney in this ever-changing dynamic that is American and now global life. So this starts the first part of the discussion of law, race, and the Constitution in the Obama context, beginning with Charles Hamilton Houston and the discussion of the social engineer. And what I will discuss in next week's podcast is a theoretical paradigm, the mapping the colonial context onto the legal sphere. What we've heard here preliminarily is the introduction to what African American attorneys' role has been and continues to be in society, or how the dynamic has changed in society. In fact, African American attorneys have been at the helm of African American society and communities. And many African Americans are operating not necessarily along class and race lines, but are operating consistent with the nuances of society at this time. Now, when I say class and race, I mean class and race intersection. But in terms of economic viability, African American attorneys are working for economic viability for their progeny, for their families, for people with whom they are affiliated in their alliances, to create financial wealth and prosperity. Now, does this mean that there's no more community fight, no more boycotting? Does this mean that there's no more sit-ins and things that happened during the time when Martin Luther King was fighting for civil rights, and the many people, both black and white, and the many races who fought together for civil rights? And much of this book comes on the heels of the Civil Rights the Civil Rights Act, which had to be reinstated for the purposes, not the word I want to use, but had to be reinstated or reauthorized under the Obama presidency. And looking at what the African American attorney's role will be with the reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act, will African American attorneys work toward matters that are based on race and matters that are based on class as it regards race, black economic upliftment, or black political upliftment, or black social upliftment, Or will African American attorneys and are African American attorneys primarily concerned with the business of law, with maintaining a law firm, with moving forward in the practice of law, whatever that area of law may be, whether it be corporate law, whether it be bankruptcies, whether it be just general civil litigation, and what the role of the attorney is in that regard. So, this podcast has been the introduction to law, race, in the Constitution, the Obama context, and this has been the introduction discussing Charles Hamilton Houston, the social engineer, and what the role of the African American attorney will be in the 21st century and moving forward, and looking also back at the past and history of how the African American attorney has evolved and Charles Hamilton Houston's impact on that evolution of the African American attorney.